Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's event in the Poli-Talks series, Likud, Past, Present, and Future. This event is co-hosted by Kerem House and Israeli Politics Simplified. Kerem House is a community-focused organization based in Tel Aviv. Kerem House has run 226 events prior to COVID for Israelis and internationals alike. Kerem House reopened in May and has, as of now, run over 30 events. Kerem House continues to host communal events, especially every Tuesday on Kerem Tuesday. Kerem House also has monthly Shabbat dinners, camping trips, exercise classes, workshops, and online talks like this one. Check out the Kerem House Facebook page or website for more information. Israeli Politics Simplified is a Facebook page dedicated to bringing Anglos in Israel and around the world unbiased, easy to understand information about Israeli politics. I'm Meira Lerner, creator of the Israeli Politics Simplified page and host of the Poli-Talks series. Over the past few months, Kerem House and Israeli Politics Simplified have worked together to produce our virtual event series titled Poli-Talks, meant to inform and empower English speakers to make informed decisions that can impact their lives in Israel. During the lead up to the recent Israeli election, we interviewed candidates from parties across the spectrum, as well as having analysis events. We are proud to say that the series has amassed over 12,000 views between our different stream talks. We've also started a new initiative, producing interesting talks that bring value not directly connected to politics, such as our recent discussion with Rafael Cohen from the World Zionist Organization about the WZO and Zionism today, and our more topical event discussing how best to fight the misinformation campaign against Israel with Lev Yuroditsky. Moving forward, we hope and plan to bring you more valuable content and continue the Poli-Talks series with more interviews with Knesset members and analysts and commentary on current events in Israeli politics and the Jewish world. Today, we'll be diving back into the political realm as we learn all about the Likud. After being the ruling party in Israel for 12 years, much attention has been paid to the Likud and, of course, its leader, Benjamin Netanyahu. After so many years as prime minister and party leader, it is easy to understand why many of us associate the Likud with Netanyahu and vice versa. But the Likud is made up of more than just one man, and its tenure in Israeli politics stretches much farther back than just 12 years. As one of the founding parties of Israel as a modern state and the biggest party in Israeli politics today, the Likud has made a profound impact on Israeli society and on Jews around the world. Today, we'll learn about the beginnings of the Likud under Menachem Begin and the role they played in the early days of the State of Israel, the Likud's place in Israeli society today, and now in the opposition, what the next steps may be for the party moving forward, and so much more. Joining us for this discussion is Ariel Bulshtein, former advisor to then Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu. Ariel formerly served as head of public diplomacy for the Euro-Asian Jewish Congress. He founded the Face of Israel, leading Israel advocacy organization, and served as its CEO. In addition, he has been a lecturer in the field of Israeli studies for the past decade. He lectures widely at Jewish and non-Jewish organizations, academic institutions, and universities in Israel and abroad, in English, Russian, and Hebrew. He is also a senior columnist for Israel Hayom newspaper and a frequent guest on various Israeli and foreign television and radio networks. Ariel is a practicing lawyer and serves as deputy chairman of the International Committee of the Israeli Bar, board member of the Jabotinsky Institute, and board member of the Jabotinsky Council at the Prime Minister's Office. With that, it is my pleasure to introduce Ariel Bulshtein. Welcome, Ariel.
Thank you. Good evening. And first of all, thank you for inviting me and for giving me the pleasure to introduce you the biggest and I would say the most influential Israeli political movement, starting from its roots. And I think we have enough time to speak also about history, about current events, and maybe a brief projection into the future.
Sure.
So let's start with the Israeli history.
Yes, I would love to get, because I don't think that people realize that the founding of the State of Israel had a lot of political content to it, not just in terms of how the world viewed the founding of the state, but also in terms of the internal struggle as to how that would come about. So I'd love to dive in from there and give people a real view of what that tension was like and how things really came to be.
You're right. Israeli political divisions and high degree of political heat in our country didn't start yesterday and didn't start in 1948 when the modern Israeli state was reestablished. It started much earlier, I would say at least 100 years ago in in the 20s and 30s of the previous century. And the most important figure who actually established what was called back then the revisionist movement was Vladimir, or if we use his Hebrew name, Ze'ev Jabotinsky, which was a Renaissance man, very gifted in different fields, poems, literature, romance. He knew about people have different opinions between 15 to 20 different languages, knew perfectly. And he could become almost anybody who could become a Swiss journalist or Russian poet, but he preferred to stay loyal to his own people and to dedicate his life and his energy, which was almost boundless, to the state of Israel and to establishing of the state of Israel. What his major dispute with the mainstream Zionist movement. Starting in 20s, he felt that the major mainstream movement was not active enough in defending the values of Zionism. Jabotinsky viewed himself as a real pupil of Herzl. He doesn't have any other ideas. Of course, he had a lot of ideas, but his main idea was that we should sacrifice anything else in order to achieve the main goal, to establish the Jewish state. It was especially important in 30s when Nazis came to power in Germany, and it was pretty obvious to Jabotinsky that it would end in huge catastrophe in Europe. He was the only Jewish figure, leader, that felt that something terrible is going to happen. And his idea was to promote the establishment of Israel as fast as possible. And he felt that his brothers in Zionist movement are not as active as it should be. So his answer was, first of all, to be active inside the movement and try to persuade anybody and everybody that we should be more active. And when it was not effective enough, he turned to establish another Zionist movement, which was called the New Zionist Movement, and to revision the activity of the previous Zionist movement. And that was actually the base for the name, Revisionist Movement. And after the establishment of the State of Israel, his pupils established a political party, which was called Herut, Freedom. And in 1970s, the party was reformed and broadened its electoral base to include another political forces which were close enough to Herut. And then the Likud, as we know it today, was born in 1973. And 4 years later, in 1977, it came to power when, for the first time after almost more than a generation, Israel witnessed the change of political forces that ruled the country. But the main division between Jabotinsky and his movement, revisionist movement, and I would say the mainstream Zionists that were ruled by socialist Zionism, was that we doesn't have nor the right nor the reason to concede something that is ours historically, morally, legally, politically. And for example, one of the ideas that Jabotinsky promoted is that the Jewish state should be established on the both banks of Jordan River, which includes the modern state of Israel, plus the Judea and Samaria, plus the modern kingdom of Jordan, which, according to the first terms of international mandate that the United Kingdom received about 100 years ago should be part of the Jewish homeland, and the British unfortunately forgot very early about their moral and legal obligation to the Jewish people to establish a Jewish state on both banks of the river. Jabotinsky didn't like this kind of breaching obligations, so he demanded that the Jewish homeland will be on the western bank of Jordan and on the eastern bank of Jordan. And later, when the Jewish community here in Palestine or the land of Israel suffered at least thrice of different waves of pogroms. First of them was in 1920 and 21, the second one in 1929, and the third one, the biggest, was in the end of 30s, starting from 36 to 39. Jabotinsky demanded that we use the same instruments that he promoted back in country of his birth, in Russia. In the beginning of the previous century, the Jews in the majority of places in Russia suffered of pogroms, and the Jabotinsky reply, his answer to this kind of phenomena was to defend the Jews by the Jews. That was his idea, that was practiced in my hometown, in Kishinev. You probably know about the famous Kishinev pogrom in 1903, and Jabotinsky visited my hometown. Of course, it happened something like 70 years before I was born. But his idea to the Jews of Kishinev, to Jews of his hometown of Odessa, and other Jews throughout the globe was, if somebody wants to hurt you, to kill you, you should protect yourself. And it worked. It worked in Russian Empire. So Jabotinsky proposed the same idea, just on bigger scale. First of all, Jews should protect themselves here against any enemy. And if there are riots that part of them are pogroms against Jews by Arab population, Jews should defend themselves. So he is not only the founder of right-wing or revisionist Zionism, he also is the founder of idea of a Jewish national army. And the first Jewish fighting squadrons were established by him and his colleague, Joseph or Yosef Trumpeldor, as part of the British army during the First World War. And then Jabotinsky used the same idea and proposed to establish a Jewish army during the Second World War. Unfortunately, as you probably know, he died as a pretty young man, 60 years old, in 1940. So he couldn't see the establishment of Tzal, the Israel Defense Forces, and the establishment of Israel. But I think that his ideas are still functioning today. They were implemented by Likud as a political movement and a political party. And I think that if we are making a big leap forward to current days, I think that his ideas today are broadly supported also by the government coalition and by the opposition, which includes today the Likud and the other right-wing parties. So the major difference between revisionism Zionism and socialist Zionism were, first of all, be more active to protect ourselves, demand everything that we have a legal, a moral, and a historical right to, without any compromise. And the third idea or third difference, which was very important back then, before Israel was established, and was important after it was established, but it's less important today, is the economics. Because as is quite understood, the mainstream socialist Zionists supported a socialist idea of establishing here a state which will be based on principles of, some of them supported hardline communism, others supported softer socialist ideas, but the base was, of course, a collective idea, no place for freedom market, no place for private property, and so on. That was another point that Jabotinsky couldn't agree to, and his demand was to establish a free state based on private initiative, but with another important component, that the state will provide the poorer, or I would say citizens who cannot provide themselves with everything they need. Jabotinsky believed that we should provide them with the equal opportunities, and if they cannot achieve education to their kids, for example, we should provide them with this kind of education in order to have for this kid the same starting base as for anybody else. So that was another important point. Back then, the ideological fight between the socialists and the free marketers was much more important than in modern day Israel, because today, I think, after the socialist idea collapsed in Soviet Union and other socialist states, it became unpopular in Israel too. I, for example, came to Israel in 1990. So I remember the last first May Day parade in Israel that was led not by some marginal activists, but by the two persons who served as Israeli prime ministers before that day and after that day. I mean, of course, Shimon Peres and Yitzhak Rabin. They were the leaders of May Day parade with red flags in Haifa in 1990. But that was the last year that the socialist idea was still part of the Israeli, I would say, ruling class.
I'd actually like to talk a little bit more about that, because you brought up the differences between revisionist Zionism and socialist Zionism. We talked a lot about how a piece of a big component of revisionist Zionism was this idea of defending yourself and being more active and being more proactive in terms of creating a Jewish state in Israel. So I'd love to talk a little bit more about that in terms of who were leading these movements at the beginnings of the founding of Israel, which were, for those who don't know, which is Menachem Begin, who was heading the revisionist Zionist movement, which was at the time the fighting force that he was leading was the Irgun. And then a lot of the people that were part of Irgun and Begin, they formed Cherut and then Likud. And on the other side, kind of representing the socialist Zionism movement, was David Ben-Gurion, who was, of course, the first prime minister. He was also the head of the Haganah, which is the other fighting force of Israel. And he, as of course we all know, did in fact become the first prime minister of Israel. And he remained in power for quite a long time. His party, which was Mapai then, became Labor, was the ruling party for quite a long time until Likud took power. So I'd love to dive a little bit more into those tensions. If you could talk more about what the contrast was between these two leaders, between their ideology, between what they were bringing to the table, and how that voting base played out.
It's a very interesting question. Unfortunately, I do not think that I have enough time to elaborate about everything.
Of course not.
I would start even with the interesting relationship between Jabotinsky and Ben-Gurion. Few people know, but in 1934, they met in London for a very intensive period of time, about a month, and had negotiations, tete-a-tete, only two people. Every one of them, of course, represented his part of Zionist movement. And what is important, that they reached an agreement. And just think for a moment how Israeli and Jewish history could be different if this agreement that we are united could be implemented back then in 30s. Unfortunately, it was rejected by the socialist part, which could imply some kind of democracy. The leader, David Ben-Gurion, accepted it, but his grassroots movement didn't accept it. And of course, during the awful years of Holocaust, the Zionist movement was divided. And exactly that same division continued, as you mentioned, after Israel was established, and Begin and David Ben-Gurion were bitter rivals. I think this kind of word could...
it's a nice way of putting it.
Yes, to propose very... They were bitter rivals in terms of ideology, but I'm pretty sure, I know that they respected each other. Begin was more a philosopher, more intellectual than Ben-Gurion, and maybe, don't quote me, but maybe that was his problem, because sometimes as a political leader, you shouldn't be an intellectual. You should be a very practical person, because you need more votes in the election ballots and not more profound thought in your ideas. Unfortunately, I would prefer another world, but in a real world, you need practical advantage. And David Ben-Gurion knew how to achieve this practical advantage, sometimes with less democratic tools, but that was another time. In Israel, you could, for example, in 40s and 50s, they could accept teachers to the education system with specific views. And for example, teachers with right-wing revisionist views were not welcome in our education system. That was one of the tools that gave to the Mapai party an opportunity to rule for a lot of time. One of the points that were dividing points back in this year, in years of early years of Israel, for example, in the beginning of 50s, was the bitter division about the issue of contacts with West Germany after the Holocaust. Begin couldn't accept even the idea that we are talking to devil. And of course, back then, in the Jewish people that only a couple of years ago suffered from the biggest tragedy in the human history, talking to the same people, and basically they were the same people, was unacceptable for Begin. And one of the most meaningful events back then was, for example, the huge demonstration that was organized by Begin in Jerusalem, and he called to the demonstrators to do everything to stop the agreement between Israel and Germany, and it could even went to a civil war. Fortunately, I think that both sides in this division were wise enough not to go there. Another point of hit that could lead to a real civil war was the Altalena affair. You probably know about the ship full of weapons and Jewish volunteers that was brought by revisionists in June 1948 during the Independence War, when the new established Israeli army was lacking everything, people, weapons, everything. And Begin brought this big ship to help, to assist Jews from his organizations and from other organizations, including Haganah, that fought during the Independence War against the Arab armies. And David Ben-Gurion didn't like the idea that after the state is established, other organizations are doing what they want. So instead of negotiations with Begin, he preferred to use the Israeli Defense Forces, the army, to bombard the ship, and people died during this day. So that was very bitter day, and only the self-restraint of Begin, who called to his people not to do the same thing. Don't shoot at our brothers even if they shoot on you. So that was his reply, and that stopped the potential civil war in Israel, happily and fortunately. And this kind of bitter rivalry continued throughout the 50s, the 60s, when David Ben-Gurion decided to step down. Actually, that was not his decision. His party decided that he will not be a leader anymore. The other leaders of Mapai were less bitter rivals. For example, Levi Eshkol, who was the substitute to David Ben-Gurion in the 60s, agreed to bring to Israel the corpse, the body of Jabotinsky, who was buried in New York and wanted, of course, to be buried in Israel after the Jewish state is established. Ben-Gurion, for something like 15 years, didn't want even to discuss the possibility that the symbol of his political rivals will be brought to burial in Israel. But happily, in 60s, I would say that the degree of this ideological fight became to deteriorate. And in 60s and 70s, it became less ideological and became, I would say, more social issue. What do I mean by this kind of term? And it continues to be social rivalry even today in current day Israel. We see that people who are descendants of immigrants, the Jewish immigrants who came here in the beginning of 20th century, and where most of them were socialists, their descendants still support the Israeli left. And who support the Israeli right? The minority was pupils of Jabotinsky, who also came from Eastern Europe. The majority of them came from the former Russian Empire and different states that were established after it collapsed. Poland and Ukraine and Russia and Belarus and so on. They were the few ideological leaders and founders of Likud. But it was not enough to have a victory during the election days, because as I said, they were very ideological, but less practical. In order to came to power, Begin broadened his party base and accepted into this ideological framework. He accepted people that were new immigrants from South Africa, like Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, and so on, from Egypt, from Iran, Iraq, people that felt during those days, 60s and 70s, that they were what they called the second Israel.
It was almost a class war of the Ashkenazi socialists and the...
It's less a class fight, because a classical class fight presumes that the ruling class is, for example, richer than the other classes. It was not the case in Israel. Israel was a very egalitarian society, meaning that there were a few rich people here, and even they didn't use their money because that was not acceptable by society codes. But newcomers from Muslim countries, Jews who came from Muslim countries, felt that in a cultural sense, they don't play the first violin in our orchestra. Some of these feelings were quite rooted in reality. Others, like with every kind of immigrants, are sometimes subjective feelings that doesn't reflect all the complexity of our life. Because when you move from one country to another, in first years, sometimes in first decades, there are objective reasons why cannot you be accepted in a moment by your society. And you and me know that personally, I suppose.
Yes.
And this is not necessarily a result of a ruling class decision to let you populate only the third class or fourth class places in this train, of course. And that was a mix of objective reasons and feelings that were not necessarily part of reality. But you cannot argue with feelings. So people who came from Muslim countries felt that they are less welcomed in Mapai party, for example, and some of them preferred Likud without any ideological background. But they quickly discovered that this party does reflect their worldview. For example, this party as a conservative movement, not socialist movement, is more sympathetic to Jewish tradition, for example, than the Labour Party. So even if the decision of some of them was, I would say, a realistic decision to join the parties that just give you a place, after that, it was a classic match that was based not only on a political opportunity, an opportunity to jump on the right train, but it was also a match that was glued by the same worldview. And this mix of Ashkenazi ideologists that fought against the British and against the Arabs in Irgun, and newcomers, young people that were energetic and full of, I would say, passion to realize themselves in a new political home. That was the basis of Likud in 70s.
So that kind of brings us to the Likud finally coming into power. And at the time, this was after, I mean, if this was in the late 70s, so we can imagine this was like almost 30 years of the ruling class being Mapai and the socialist Zionism. And out of many years of being on the sidelines, the Likud and Begin finally come to power. And at the time it was called a Ma'apach, and this was a huge change for Israeli society. Can you speak a little bit more about what that change and that upheaval and that Ma'apach, where it was coming from and how it really came about and what that did for Israeli society moving out of that?
First of all, I think that you and me and any Israeli today cannot imagine the emotional degree, the feelings that people felt in this night in May 1977, when it was said on television, that Israel changes its rulers. Even the word Ma'apach was developed by a TV show man who proclaimed this result. There was not, it was not existing before. Even the term, the political term for changing the rulers. And of course, both sides, the socialists who were defeated and the revisionists who were winning, both of them were very emotional. And I think that maybe this kind of huge emotional degree was a problem, because on the winner side, it produced high level of expectations that maybe only in theory can be implemented, because you cannot implement everything of course, not in terms of one political Knesset term of 4 years maximum, and sometimes it's less than that. On the other side, the left side was pretty sure that the end of the days is coming, that Israel is entering a terrible period of constant wars and of destroying everything that they succeeded to establish.
I would also just add before you continue that for the rest of the world, especially the European world, they viewed Begin almost like a terrorist. Like that's, I mean, the British referred to him as a terrorist. This was a huge change for the rest of the world, which was first getting used to the idea of an Israel and now having to deal with an entirely new philosophy and leadership coming in and changing those relationships.
You're right. You're of course right. But I wouldn't exaggerate the role that Israel played back then for Europe and for other countries. Back then, we were less important than today. And of course, the international media is always writes about everything. But I think that the major focus of or focal point of the emotions was here. And of course, especially among the left elite, that was sure that everything is gone now. And Begin was much more classical European gentleman than his political rivals. His political rivals on the left were sure that he will rule with the same passion and with the same instruments that they used. Meaning that, for example, in 1 week, he will change all the public servants in our country because they nominated somebody in the government only according to his political loyalty. Begin didn't establish this kind of approach. His approach was very different. And a lot of people in my political camp actually blame Begin for being too polite, I would say too cautious, too constrained in implementing his ideology. But first of all, we should remember that he did implement a lot of his ideology. For example, his view, according to Jabotinsky ideas, that the Jewish people is real owner, legal owner, moral owner of Judea, Samaria, and Gaza. And he established a lot of settlements there. He assisted in broadening the settlers movement in Judea and Samaria and Gaza. And without his support, I couldn't imagine this huge movement going to big numbers like we see today. Another change was in the economy field. It was not done in 1 day or 1 year, but he started to change Israeli economy from very socialist to free market. And of course, it was done with a lot of opposition from the left, from the powerful Histadrut, the Israeli trade unions, that actually today are trade unions, but back then they were more powerful than a state. Actually, we have a joke that in every country they have trade union. In Israel, the trade union had a country. And it was only partly joke. It was some kind of reality. And it took something like 15 to 20 years to make this shift from socialist economy, which was very similar to, in some way, it was very similar to socialist economies in Eastern Europe. Of course, without prisons, without political repression in this cruel way that we witnessed in the Soviet Union, for example, but with some other ways of persuasion, yes? Yes. So Israeli economy was changing very quickly. And in the end of 80s, I think it became real free market. but we still have a lot of problems with monopolies, for example. Chevrat HaChashmal, the Israeli electrical company, the same in water supply, Mekorot, and so on. That is still the result of the socialist worldview that ruled for more than 30 years, and it couldn't be changed even when the socialists were defeated by Begin. His other ideas, for example, promoted the newcomers, the immigrants, Jewish immigrants from Muslim countries, to more important positions. And of course, this kind of approach continued when Begin stepped down and Yitzhak Shamir was the leader of Likud instead of him and was the Israeli prime minister. And then we are coming to the era of Benjamin Netanyahu that actually started in the previous century.
Wow. Before I think we're going to move this more into present day now. I think it was a great way to kind of bring things up to date and a great way to give people kind of a foundation of where this idea of Likud came from. But before we move forward, just for anybody's general interest, if you want to know more about Begin, just to, even casually, I would certainly recommend people read The Prime Ministers. I think it's a fantastic book and gives a really amazing view of Begin and those early days of Israel. In addition to that, there's a new English film called Upheaval, which is, Ma'apach, that was actually just released. I was lucky enough to be at the premiere. I don't think it's available for release yet, but it's a movie based on the Prime Ministers. It's a documentary, and it gives a really amazing view of Menachem Begin and those early days of Likud. That was just for anybody's general interest, because I think Menachem Begin is one of the most amazing leaders of Israel that we've ever had, and I think everybody should learn more about him. But that's just my own personal.
I would also like to add my recommendation to read his book about the uprising against the British, which is there is another book that he wrote about his experience in Soviet labor camp, because he was arrested by the Soviet forces when they, after the Molotov-Ribbentrop agreement, when they entered Poland, and he was almost immediately arrested, and he suffered for almost a year in Soviet Gulag. And I do not know if this book was translated into English, but I'm pretty sure that it should be. So if anybody wants to learn more about his early experience during this kind of Gulag years and then fighting for the establishment of Israel, I would also recommend to do it.
Great. So now that we've gotten our recommendations out there for people, let's talk about Likud now. We talked a little bit about the ideology of early Likud, the ideology of revisionist Zionism as a whole. Let's talk a little bit about the ideology of Likud now and what differentiates it really from other right-wing parties. At the time, in the early days, there was really it was Likud and Labor. We didn't have nearly as many of these splintering parties as we do now, obviously. So what would you say should be considered the ideology of Likud, and how is it different from some of these other right-wing ideologies?
What is interesting is that, according at least to my mind, the ideology of Likud didn't change a lot from the days that it was elaborated by Jabotinsky. His most important article, which was called The Iron Wall, was written almost 100 years ago in 1923. And in this article, he proposed his vision of living in our motherland, which is surrounded and partly populated by a lot of Arabs. And his view that was coined as Iron Wall is still implemented by the majority, and it was implemented by the majority of Israeli prime ministers, including David Ben-Gurion, without mentioning the root of this vision. But the vision was very realistic, and it stayed realistic up to date. with a lot of respect, by the way, to Arabs. Jabotinsky even wrote that we do not hate Arabs, we hugely respect them. We respect them as we respect ourselves. And basing on this respect, we understand that they would not forget quickly about their national feeling towards this country. And his idea was that we need to circle ourselves by a figural, not real, iron wall, which was, of course, the Israeli power to defend itself. And this iron wall will stop any invaders, perpetrators, enemies, till they understand. And he actually visioned that they will understand someday that it is a stubborn idea to try to break the iron wall. It is stronger than you. And then you should accept the Israeli existence, and then you should talk peace with Israel. What is interesting that this idea worked on both of these stages. First of all, Israel succeeded in stopping any enemy, invader, terrorist, and so on. So the iron wall actually performed well, but it performed well even in the second stage, in his idea that the strength of this wall will lead to Arab understanding that it is better to talk peace with Israel. And this is also something that we experienced, first of all, during the term of Menachem Begin as Israeli prime minister, the first peace agreement with Egypt, which was signed not by socialists, by Israeli right. And it is something that we saw during the last year of Benjamin Netanyahu term, the last term of Netanyahu in office, when Israel actually signed what I call the classical right-wing peace agreement. What do I mean by this term? I mean that we acted ideologically as our ideology permits us, meaning that we want peace, but we do not think that it is a right thing to compromise, especially when the compromise is dealing with our motherland, with our capital, with our historical regions like Judea and Samaria. But we believe that peace can be achieved without giving this territory to anybody, especially not to the enemies of Israel. So if we are going back to your question, what is the modern day ideology of Likud? It's the same, at least in this most important aspect of our life. Basically, there are two different approaches towards the relations between Jews and Arabs in the Middle East. The leftist approach is let buy some kind of agreement by giving to the other side what they want. First of all, territory, but we can give something else. For example, we can give something inside Israel, not territory. We can give them the same status of owners of this land. We can, for example, forget that this is a nation state of the Jewish people. That is the idea, the basic idea of the left, the basis idea of the right camp, which was established by Jabotinsky and now comprises predominantly of Likud party and its splitting parties. But the major idea is that in order to achieve peace, or at least some kind of coexistence with Arabs in the Middle East, you shouldn't give them territory, which is ours, but you should be strong enough in order for them to understand that Israel's existence is forever. And they will understand that at some point, and then they will understand that peace is better for them, not only for Israel, than war. So I think we actually saw two of these approaches and two of these rival ideologies in their implementations. Oslo agreements were the implementation of the left idea, and it didn't bring peace. It brought only bloodshed and a lot of deaths. By the way, not only to Jews, to Arabs too. And we saw the implementations of right-wing idea in its classical, clear way. And of course, peace agreements with 4 Arab countries, starting with United Arab Emirates, where I think the highest point of implementations of right-wing approach. Speaking about other aspects, not necessarily security and relations with our world, we of course are speaking about economy. The Likud worldview was that it should be free market. We should regulate it as less as possible. We shouldn't interfere. We shouldn't accept the idea that monopolies will stay monopolies. And this kind of approach also was shown, and its results were shown in Israeli economy in the last years. This kind of shift from the socialist ideas to free market ideas were the reason why Israel had a very huge step forward starting in 90s. By the way, this kind of shift was supported also by other, not Likud governments that were existing, for example, in the beginning of this century. I think in this kind of ideological fight, Likud definitely won. Nobody here can imagine today shift back to socialist economy. This kind of result is irreversible. In other fields, I think that we still do not have irreversible results. However, I think that the number of Jews that live today in Judea and Samaria is also irreversible. So in this aspect, we could also achieve partly its goal, but only partly. I think that the ultimate result should be the fact that Judea and Samaria, at least all the settlements, all the villages, towns that are populated by Jews, should be officially part of the state of Israel. And then I would say that our goal is this aspect is also achieved.
So before we move on, I'd actually just like to welcome those who have joined us. We've actually gone live. I'd like to apologize for those who are waiting. It took us some time to get the feed to go live on Facebook, but we have recorded this event and this discussion since the beginning, and we will be uploading the full recording to Facebook as soon as possible. So for anybody who missed the first half, which is all of you, unfortunately, you will be able to go back and watch the discussion from the beginning. And I certainly recommend you do, because so far it's been fascinating and a really wonderful way to explore the origins of Likud and get a much broader view of what the Likud actually is and what it stands for. So for those of you joining us, welcome. We are discussing the Likud party, past, present, and future with Ariel Bulshtein, who is a former advisor to then Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. So we've spoke about the history of Likud, spoken a little bit about the ideology of the Likud and what makes it different, certainly from the left. Let's talk a little bit about what actually makes up the Likud. Because we know that we have our MKs in Knesset, and we know that we have the leader of the Likud, which is Benjamin Netanyahu. And we keep hearing the Likud is the biggest party in Israel. It has, over 100,000 members, I believe. Correct me if I'm wrong, probably more than that.
Much more.
I'm sure much more than that. I'm just throwing out numbers. So who actually makes up the Likud? There's also, there's a global Likud movement. There's executive committees, there's, steering committee. I mean, who is the Likud? Who makes it up?
It's an interesting question and a complex one. First of all, you are right. Israel has different parties, but Likud is the biggest by far. The current number of qualified party members is more than 140,000. And the real number of party members is even bigger, because when we use the term qualified, we mean people who were disciplined in paying their membership fees. And sometimes people change bank accounts and stop paying. So the number of all members is closer to 200,000, which is a huge number if we still remember that we are not the biggest country on earth. Even when we compare it to some bigger countries in Europe, ruling parties are not usually do not enjoy this kind of numbers. But of course, you were right again when you mentioned that Likud has different institutions, and it's a complex structure with a lot of diffusion of power, which I think a positive side of our democratic existence, because in Israel basically you have two formats of political parties. One is more common, I would say, is a ruler party, somebody who establishes his own party based on his own personality. We have a lot of them, for example, Lieberman's party, Lapid's party, and so on. And usually it is connected only to this personality, and when a person decides to step down from politics or, God forbid, passes away, the party goes away with him. Likud is another story. First of all, it is open to everybody who thinks that the views of Likud are also his views. Second, it is open to anybody who wants to be more active than only voting on election day. The first step for this kind of political activism is to be elected to Likud Central Committee. I would say that it is not written, for example, in our basic documents, but if you have 10 supporters, 10 people who support you, you will be part of Likud Central Committee. I think it's a very realistic bar for almost everybody who has friends, who has people that share the same ideology. And then when you're part of Central Committee, you actually can more affect than any voter, because you not only voting, you decide who will be on the next list of Likud candidates for next Knesset. And of course, you can be a candidate by yourself. There are different opportunities in Likud. In addition to major lists, there are slots on the list that are reserved for women, for new immigrants, for national minorities like Druze and Arab minority, for representatives of specific regions in Israel. And that is an approach that provides an opportunity for new blood to be part of the old structure. And to my mind, this is a very charming mix of something based and something new. And when I say that this opportunity exists, I do not mean a theoretical approach. I mean very practical things. All of Likud leaders and actually Knesset members, ministers, former ministers, started on the same level of this entrance as central party members, and then trying to be elected. Some of them succeeded in the first time, but one of the people that I respect mostly in this Knesset, it's former Speaker Yariv Levin, was elected to the Likud list only on his third trial. And he is a leading Knesset member. He was chairman. He's very close to Benjamin Netanyahu. He's one of the most prominent Israeli politicians, and only his understanding that you should try again and again if you are really want to be part of Israeli political system. Only that gave him an opportunity to be this kind of prominent political figure. So it is open, of course, like in every power system. At the end, you shouldn't be only nice. It helps, of course, but you should bring voters that support you. You should persuade others that you are better than your political rivals. But it is really open. It is open to English speakers. It is open to Russian speakers like me. It is interesting that different people were voted to the Likud list that were not born in Israel, including, for example, former Knesset member Yehuda Glick, who was born in the United States, and some Knesset members from the former Soviet Union and from Ethiopia. So we really can see a diversity in Likud list. You mentioned also the global movement, which is called World Likud. It is headed today by former Israeli ambassador to the United Nations, Dani Danon. I would say it is active in Jewish diaspora, in different Jewish communities. I think the voice of this movement can be even more important. It can be stronger, and I think that it is right time to leave the framework of Jewish communities only and be heard in different countries throughout the, first of all, the right-wing political camps there, center-right, and so on. So I think a lot of work can be done in this direction. Historically, it was part of the Jewish communities only because in addition to Israeli elections, there are also elections to the WZO, to the World Zionist Organizations, and then this kind of election happens inside Jewish communities. So for all the Israeli political parties was important and interesting to establish some kind of base in Jewish communities abroad. But I think that the right vision is not to be limited by Jewish communities there and try to promote Israeli interests inside the general public throughout the world.
So now that we're talking more about the makeup of the Likud, and we talked about, getting membership and being in the central committee and deciding on the candidate list. So let's actually talk a little bit more about that, because something that I find extremely interesting is that especially as an American, comes from, I've been here for a long time, but originally from America, where there's a very different electoral system. But something that doesn't really exist as much here is primaries. And right now, only two parties in Knesset hold primaries of any kind, and that would be Likud and Labor, which is interestingly the two original parties of the country and probably two of the largest in terms of membership base. Why do you think only those two parties hold primaries? And why do you think a primary system is important or should be important to other parties as well?
First of all, this primary system was a kind of news for Israel in the late 80s and beginning of 90s. And actually it was imported from the United States. Likud was the first party to introduce it. Before that, all the Israeli parties had some kind of internal committee that usually included the most prominent figures inside the party, and they decided who will be number one, number two, number three, number 33, and so on. The introduction of primary system to the Israeli politics started with Likud, and it was the answer of Likud to the challenge of making our political system more democratic, because people in those years understood that they are more than voters. They want to actually decide more than that. And the most important decision is who is representing you personally in Knesset. So it was not enough to present the right ideology. It was also the necessary step to open the doors for people to influence. And this was accepted, first of all, by Likud, then by Labor, by some other parties. The majority of them decided then to go back to personal decision by party ruler or his close associates. It's an interesting philosophical question. When do you have better list in these two options? Frankly, I can say that there are no tools to decide what is better, because sometimes during democratic elections, we have people that are elected, and then in Knesset, we see that they are not necessarily the best Knesset members. Of course, in this case, the voters can have an opportunity to have another vote next time. But for a couple of years, sometimes for 4 years, we can have problematic Knesset members, not only Likud. And the supporters of less democratic systems of appointment tell that they can decide who is the representative on the Knesset list basing only on quality of the candidate. But of course, that is not true. We understand that usually in dictatorial parties like Israel Beitenu, the leader decides who will be on the list basing on the loyalty, on the personal loyalty to him. So I think there is no perfect system. The system of primary definitely have more democratic advantages. This is a real opportunity for grassroots members to decide who will be their representative. In addition, it is also a beautiful instrument against political detectors or against people who tend to forget what is the ideology of their party. Because if they are not loyal, not to personal leader, but to ideology, they will not be elected again by huge masses. You cannot manipulate huge masses. You can probably manipulate 10 people, 12 people, 20 people if you are a very talented manipulator. But to manipulate dozens of thousands, and in Likud, in order to be elected to the Knesset list, you need sometimes 50,000 voters. By the way, in the last election in Labor Party, to be elected the leader of the party, you needed something like 10,000 voters.
Oh, wow.
10,000 is not enough to be number 40 on Likud list. So when the numbers are huge, I think there is some kind of wise decision. And to my mind, there are more advantages than disadvantages to this kind of system. It definitely is more democratic.
So you spoke a little bit about the system being more open and anybody can join and that it should be a home for anybody that wants to join, and as long as you agree with the ideology. We, as you know, the host of the talk series, and me being the host of a page specifically dedicated to helping Israeli politics become more approachable to Anglos in Israel, something that I always look to learn more about and discuss more of is Anglo representation. There's a large number of Anglo Olim in Israel. And And lately, there has been a lot more discussion about this issue of Anglo representation in Knesset and in politics in Israel in general. I think that a lot of people see Likud as being a very Israeli-rooted party. It's a party that's been around pretty much since the beginning, as we discussed. As far as I know, I mean, we did mention Yehuda Glick, who was American-born, and he was in MK on the Likud list for a while back. He's no longer in Knesset. He's still a Likud member, of course, but he's no longer in MK. Whereas other parties, we do see, there is some Anglo representation, whether it's, Naftali Bennett, who is the son of American Olim, and he also has Jeremy Sultan on his list. And even if there's no specific Anglo representation, there's sometimes a lot of Anglo outreach by parties. I know that Yesh Atid does a lot of Anglo events, a lot of Anglo outreach. They work on that a lot. I don't, and if correct me if I'm wrong, I could definitely be wrong, but some people don't feel that Likud has a lot of that Anglo representation. Do you think that there is a home for Anglo-Israelis in Likud? And do you think that it's something that Likud should be more open to and having more of an American or Anglo, representation in Knesset? Is that something that they should be working more towards?
Okay. First of all, I think that you could add Benjamin Netanyahu to the list of Anglos in our Knesset.
He speaks English perfectly. He spent a very long time living in America. I don't mistake it. He is Israeli born. I believe his parents are also Israeli born. That's not to say he doesn't speak English.
No, I
meant
not only the language. A lot of people say that he's the most American in the Israeli politics, more than other people that were probably born in the United States. But that was kind of a joke, of course. I agree that Likud should be more proactive in inviting new forces inside. Unfortunately, this is the downside of democracy. Why? Because democratically, we are open to everybody. And then the expectation of the party, a lot of people in the party, is that since the doors are open, we do not need to do anything specific in order to attract new members, because they can do it. If they do not do it, probably they do not want to do it. That is a mistake. Maybe as a person who also came from another country, I understand what is the psychological barrier to enter a new organization, especially political organization, established political organization. It is sometimes frightening. Even if you know that the doors are open, you do not know the codes. You do not know how people speak to each other. What do they discuss during the small talk and so on. So I think that it is not only the duty of Likud as a life-willing political force to open the doors. It should do more to attract people who ideologically are close to us. And I think that people who came from big Jewish communities, two big Jewish communities, Russian-speaking and English-speaking communities, are by definition close to Likud ideas. Majority of them, of course. We cannot speak about 100%, never can speak about 100%. So I think personally that Likud should do more. The ideas how to implement it, of course, are my ideas or your ideas how to do it, but I think that one of the possible ways is to establish some kind of a minimum quota for Likud members that were born in the United States on the Central Committee, for example, because for a newcomer, it's difficult to persuade others that are established Likud members to vote for him. It's an objective problem, but I think that the best way in politics is not to wait that somebody will do it. And to my mind, as I said, it's necessary to do it to attract new people. But if some of our viewers now think about themselves as part of Likud ideology, to my mind, it's better for them not to wait for special invitation, but to enter the ranks, to attract others. And as I said, it's almost a rule. If you have 10 supporters, your place on the central committee list during the next internal elections is secure. And then everybody else, the existing members of the party, will see that you are good not only in talking, but also in attracting voters. And that definitely helps. So my brief reply to your right question was that it's better for Likud to do something more, but also for people who came from the United States and other English-speaking countries, do not wait for somebody else to do this special invitation, but join today.
Great. That's a great message. I hope other people will certainly take that to heart. I know that there's definitely a lot of interest within the Anglo community to push into this political system, and I certainly hope people will take that to heart. We have about 15 minutes, I would say, left. I'd love to spend that time speaking about where Likud is now and kind of projecting for the future. It's been a long time that Likud was in power, 12 years straight, with Netanyahu at the helm, and certainly we all know he's the longest serving prime minister in Israel, and he's been the head of the Likud for a very long time. But now they're in the opposition. So briefly, and I know that we could talk about this for a very long time, but just to kind of catch people up and to catch ourselves up, what do you think led to this transition of Likud moving to the opposition at this point, in the most base of explanations?
First of all, a little correction. You told that Likud was in power for 12 years. Basically, this is right, but taking into account an Israeli coalition system, actually, almost never for these 12 years, Likud was not in power for 100%, because almost in all possible coalitions during this period, Likud needed other political forces coming into the government outside of right-wing political camp. And for almost all the cases, their condition was not to implement all that Likud would like to implement. And that is very important. That one of the problems of Israeli political system, that even if your party wins, this kind of victory is only partial, and for almost never you cannot accept or expect that Likud or any other party will actually implement everything that you want and everything that Likud wants to do. That is important, I think, especially for people who came from other political system, when a winner takes all and actually have all the opportunities to implement what he thinks is right.
Absolutely. I think we could probably have another whole hour and a half discussion just talking about the coalition system and the pros and cons and how that winds up playing out. I'm sure that's certainly a huge piece of it.
Now back to your question regarding the reasons for this result. There are different reasons. One of the most important is, of course, the personal attack on Prime Minister Netanyahu that was started by the left-wing camp, supported by biggest part of the media, supported by a lot of left elites in Israeli society that are small in numbers but very dominant in public sphere. And we see that some people call it the deep state. I do not want to exaggerate, and I do not want to go to the extreme. There is no some kind of conspiracy against Prime Minister Netanyahu in a classic form. There is no dark room that 10 people gather there and decide how they will topple Netanyahu. But there is definitely understanding among the left political elite and cultural political elite that they cannot dominate an Israeli political field by numbers, but they can do it through other means. For example, starting investigations against Netanyahu on topics that nobody is investigated in Israel, and then trying to topple him through false accusations and then through media attack and so on. That is definitely part of the situation, because without that, if you are looking only on objective results of his activities, Israeli economic is flourishing, Israeli security is better than on any other stage of our national existence. Peace agreements are established without need to concede territory. It's like a dream for any Israeli. Doesn't matter if he comes from the right or from the left, because everybody enjoys the results. And it is some kind of irony that with all the positive results, Netanyahu was not elected again to the major political post. The other reason is, of course, the splitting or division inside right-wing political camp. You see, if I prefer to look on things from the ideological point of view, not from the personal point of view. And if we are doing that, we see that in the current Knesset, more than 70 Knesset members, meaning it's clear, huge majority in Israeli terms, more than 30 Knesset members see themselves as right-wing politicians or right-wing representatives. So in normal situations, they should be united, and the head of the biggest right-wing party, Likud, should be the prime minister. That was the case during all Israeli history. Unfortunately, because of the personal considerations, personal love-hate relationships between other political leaders at Netanyahu, they didn't support him. And I think it's a very pitiful result of maybe some personal relations that are not that are far from ideal. In politics, sometimes you see that almost everything is personal, and I think that now we see the result that it is very personal. If you want to ask me who is to blame for that result, I think that in every personal relations, both sides are responsible. So the blame issue is maybe not the right issue. Maybe Netanyahu could be more inviting for other leaders in the right-wing camp, even if they are not loyal to him or to the right-wing ideas. Maybe they should prefer the implementations of their worldview and not the prime ministerial position, for example, because it's clear to everybody that Bennett, who is a right-wing politician, is not able to implement any right-wing policy in current government. He speaks about that freely. It's not my invention. It's clear to everybody. So I think that the reasons are, of course, the reasons that I mentioned, but also other reasons. It's kind of an irony that when Likud succeeds, the need for Likud, as it felt by the voters, is less than before. Mm-hmm. I will try to explain that. When Israel was swept by waves of terror, which started because of the mistakes that were done by left governments, the voters wanted Likud to be back in power, to change that, to bring back security, because they understood that the Likud way of ruling the country towards security is much better. But when the security was achieved and good economy was a fact, people think that even if we try others, maybe it will not be a mistake. They tend to forget the results of both approaches, the left approach and the right approach. Usually, it doesn't take long for them to be reminded what is right in both senses of this word and what is wrong. Of course, I do not wish to our country bad results under any government. I would like that Israel will be secure and the best country on the earth. Doesn't matter who is the prime minister. But I think that the history teaches us that when we are giving back the steering wheel of our country to left-wing ideas, the results are never good. So I'm not a prophet. I do not know when something can happen and what can happen. But looking on the formation of this government and on the fact that first time in Israeli history that it depends 100% on not only on anti-Zionist party, I mean Ram, but Islamist party who would like to see Israel disappearing as a Jewish state at least. I think that's a very bad idea. And we see in the last days that it's not only a moral problem. I think it's enough, the fact that it's morally not acceptable to be dependent on somebody who wants to destroy you. But it's also a practical problem. When the coalition is formed with 61 votes out of 120 Knesset members, and every coalition member can decide what happens, otherwise he will be out of the coalition. And when this kind of coalition member would like to see your country disappearing, I think that's a very bad idea. And I hope that this kind of coalition will not exist for a long time.
So speaking of that, I mean, Netanyahu and the Likud, they've expressed that their time in the opposition is going to really be used to fight against this coalition, saying that it's a dangerous coalition, it's not practical, they can't govern. What do you think that means? What means will they use to bring this coalition down? And do you think there are any red lines as to what they can and should be doing to bring it down?
I think that the clear red line is to do what is good for the Jewish state. The best tool for bringing this government down is to propose legislation, for example, or any other steps that are based on the right-wing ideas, on the ideas of the broad national camp in Israel, which theoretically should be supported by Bennett, by Saar, and probably definitely cannot be supported by the left side of the government, and to demand from the public to see who is who. And I think that the Likud should propose the same legislation that was prepared by Lieberman, by Saar, by Bennett, and to call them, please support. And if you do not support it, explain what was the change, why you supported it yesterday and you cannot support it today. I think that's the right way. It can help to Likud too. You know, when you are in power for a lot of time, sometimes you tend to forgive yourself too much. And we should be back to our roots as an ideological movement to remind to ourselves and to the general public that we are struggling for political power, not for the sake of the political power, but for implementation of our ideas that are broadly supported in public.
So given that, where do you think that the Likud is going to go from here? Do you think there will be new primaries? We said that a lot of the issue with Likud now being in the opposition had to do with personal issues and personal attacks against Netanyahu. Do you think that there will be primaries in an effort to push him out, to have somebody else leading the party? Do you think there will be a new approach for the Likud to voters? Where do you see that going?
So first of all, Likud as a democratic movement has a very clear basic documents, legal basic documents that provide with everything for every scenario. According to this document, there is time for election inside the party for the primaries. It will not be now because according to this document, it should be done closer to the elections. Personally, I suppose that will be other contenders for the party leader post, but I do not see any opportunity for somebody to prevail against Benjamin Netanyahu, not because of some kind of personal adoration, but the majority of Likud members understand that he is better than others in implementing our ideology. So it's not kind of, sometimes I hear even some kind of critique saying, oh, you love Netanyahu and so on. No, I love my wife, my kids, my country. Towards politicians, I have a lot of respect, not necessarily love, but this kind of respect means that I understand that this person is better representative than anybody else. It's very instrumental. That's why I do not think that, of course, everything is personal in politics, as I told. But if tomorrow there is another person who is more effective in implementing Likud ideology, he will be attacked by the leftist elite with the same vigor as Netanyahu was attacked. He could be other person. Netanyahu smokes, and it can be a person who doesn't smoke, so he will be attacked by any other means. It doesn't matter, but he will be attacked. That's why I think that Netanyahu is the right person to head Likud and Israel.
So before we close up, we're not going to another election just yet, it seems, but moving forward, why should people vote for Likud, or rather, why should people join Likud and then continue to vote for Likud moving forward?
If they believe that the land of Israel should belong to the people of Israel, if they believe that our country should be a Jewish nation state and not another version of an old European country brought to the Middle East, if they believe in free market, I think their place is in Likud ranks. And this party not only showed that it can be trusted as an ideological platform, it can be trusted as a mean to implement this ideology and to make it real. And Likud have done a lot successfully. Of course, there were mistakes, and there were a lot of things that should be done better or should be done better scale, bigger scale. And that's a responsibility of the next generation of Likud members, future leaders.
You have to bring them in.
Yes.
Bring in the next group.
Invite them to make easier their entrance, and then I think they will do everything by themselves.
Sounds good. Sounds like a good plan. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Ariel. I really appreciate it. I think this was fascinating. This was a really great way to give people a much broader view of the Likud than I think that they've had probably in a very long time. Certainly the Anglo viewers who might be newer to the political scene here and don't necessarily know, what this really all is about and what the ideology is all about. And I think that's amazing for people to be able to gain that now. So I really appreciate that. And I'm sure that our viewers do as well. So thank you for joining us. And to all of our viewers, thank you for tuning in. We will, as I said, be uploading the full recording to Facebook. You can follow the Kerem House Facebook page and the Israeli Politics Simplified page to see the full recording. We should hopefully get that up, I assume, within the next day. So stay tuned for that. And please do go back and watch from the beginning because it's really worthwhile and interesting, and you'll learn a lot. So please make sure to look out for that recording. And again, follow Kerem House and Israeli Politics Simplified on Facebook to hear more about upcoming events, and stay tuned for more. So thank you, everybody. Thank you, Ariel, and have a good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Every single